The category is What the Trans Darling.
Well, hello and welcome to What the Trans.
What the trans? So, how are you doing?
Ooh, I'm fine, just transing my way through life as normal. No, I'm good, yes. I've been working and getting settled into the new place, and I read a book. All the usual Ashley life stuff. How about you?
I'm good. I've been getting really fascinated by what anti-trans nightmare people believe, where they believe being trans comes from.
Ah, yes.
And I've sort of been making a little history of it, not for any podcast piece, because it's ridiculous bullshit that no one should care about, but I found it quite amusing because there was a time where they were like, oh, goths became trans, so goth stuff makes people trans. Yeah. Then for a brief period, I think that was a Dungeons and Dragons makes people trans thing. And now the latest one appears to be anime. And I'm feeling even more ostracized from my community than I already may be, because I've never been a goth. I've not really got into anime beyond half a season of One Punch Man and a bit of Death Note. And I've not really played that much Dungeons and Dragons in my life. But as someone who I know is into or has been into all three of those things at various points to varying degrees, what do you make of this phenomena of basically kind of nerdy counterculture stuff being the root of your transness?
Oh,
Ashley Talbot.
Well, I mean, it certainly explains a lot. No, I'm kidding. Obviously, it's bollocks, as you say. I think, to me, it's always struck me as like a retooling of the Satanic Panic stuff. So you may have heard of that, but just for reference for you, dear listener, Satanic Panic was a thing mostly in America, whereby everything countercultural was labelled satanic, and people were really concerned that there were cults of Satanists prowling around and converting their children and whatever else. I remember watching a few documentaries when I was a kid, like from the early and mid-90s, about people who were convinced that their nanny had been a Satanist or something, or the woman that they'd hired to help with the kids, and one of them found her diary and said it was all satanic and stuff. And it's like, I'm pretty sure you're just making this story up. But I just find it hilarious, though, because yes, fine, I have been kind of into all of those things, although I would say I'm not that into Dungeons and Dragons as a role-playing game. But there is the joke whereby if you're playing a role-playing game and one of your players is not using it as a way to explore some gender stuff through their character, then one of you will be chosen. And
I can see the logic to that, because I think my version of that was video games. Like, this is going to be showing my age now, but Fallout 2 was a big deal for me, because that was the first game I selected to be like a woman in it as a character. Yep. And for people who are quite young listening to this, there was a Fallout 1 or 2. They were great, but they're probably unplayable by today's standards because they're 2D and you have to read a lot and all this other stuff. But I loved them as a teenager, and that was a big moment for me. And sort of through video games, I kind of did that, like Mass Effect, the game series, where you get to select your version of Shepherd. I always chose a female Shepherd.
Yep. Same.
And yeah, I think and I asked people on Twitter about this kind of thing, where do these things come from? Because they must have seen, like, this must have come from somewhere, even though it is quite coming from a shitty area. Like, they must have seen a trans person like anime and decide all trans people became trans because anime or something. And the answers I got were quite interesting. A lot of people were saying that they saw gender variants of some kind in anime, varying from Pokemon,
Sailor Moon,
to series that I can't pronounce, like on the hardcore end of anime, where you have to basically learn Japanese to enjoy them. And there are gender variant characters in those things that made people start to think, that is really vibing with me.
I wonder why. Yes, and I would say that my own experience in terms of, being a musician and kind of falling into, although I didn't try specifically to end up in a goth band, and I wouldn't say St. Lucifer is a full-on goth band, but we definitely take notes from the aesthetic.
Yeah, both your bands definitely have goth followings. Like, that is a thing I've noticed.
For sure. I mean, so the biggest festival Dead Pixel ever did, the other band, it was Infest, which is absolutely a goth festival. There's no getting away from it, even though it's held in the middle of summertime and there's all these people walking around in black PVC and sweating like you wouldn't believe. But I would say that my initial dalliances with experimenting with eyeliner and makeup and stuff and carrying a bass guitar around, it kind of meant you could get away with a lot more, because a lot of metal and punk and all the stuff that I was listening to when I was a teenager and in my 20s kind of had at least a little bit of that aesthetic, and use of makeup was expected, if not encouraged. So I can kind of see where it's coming from, in a sense, because I think a lot of trans people do end up into that kind of alternative counterculture stuff because it provides that welcoming space. And I think the same is true for anime and other, shall we say, slightly nerdier pursuits, because of things like cons. Where you can go and cosplay as someone from Sailor Moon or as FemShep or whatever. I'm absolutely with you on the video games thing, though. And I'm sure I was playing, I can't remember what game it was, but I was playing a game as a female character and my mum walked in and she's like, "Oh, so you're a girl in this game, are you?" "Oh, yeah, I chose the female character because when the enemies are shooting at you, the female character actually has a smaller hitbox, so they're less likely to hit you. It's just a tactical thing. There's no other reason for it, honest." So...
Oh, if I'm being honest, I got caught by a friend and they asked, and I came up with this wonderful thing, which I'm not particularly proud of, but it did the job at the time. "Oh, I like the look of the character's butt."
Oh yeah, that was the other classic. Yeah. It's like, "Oh well, of course.
I'm such a straight cis man. Really, please believe me. Don't dive any deeper, please.
Don't ask me any further questions." Anyway, shall we do a podcast?
Yeah, we've got a packed episode because this episode is almost entirely our interview with Stonewall CEO Nancy Kelley, which we will dive into shortly. But before that, we have a couple of very brief news points we wanted to get through. Oh no, not the news, the news. But it's brief. It's brief news, and
just a quickie.
Yes, just a quickie. So at time of recording yesterday, on the 12th of May, there was another oral evidence session for the GRA inquiry being held by Parliament, specifically the Women and Equality Select Committee, which is being chairpersoned by Caroline Noakes, a Conservative MP. This has caused a lot of anxiety in the community because there has been a lot of focus on when the bad uns talk to it. The bad uns give evidence, and previously representatives from Women's Place UK, Fair Play for Women, and some other group that I cannot remember the name of and don't care enough to look up, basically talked a load of bullshit to the committee, and that caused some obvious anxiety. But what has been missed, as we've reported before, was that a trans man had gave evidence, and there has been a lot of people who you could call allies and trans people themselves giving evidence to this committee.
There has indeed.
And that seems to be not as noticed by the community. And I understand why, because you're in the headlights, a car's coming towards you, you're going to notice that more than you are going to notice, like, a beautiful array of flowers on the side of the road. So I totally understand why people would miss this. But that happened yesterday when Action for Trans Health Durham were called to give evidence to the committee. And from reports that I've read online and from Pink News, they knocked it out of the park by saying that the gender identity clinic system that we have now is not fit for purpose, and GPs should be the people that are dispensing healthcare for gender dysphoria and trans people in general. And that happened yesterday. The committee heard the good word from people. They also heard from Action for Trans Health Durham, are incredible. I have to admit, was surprised to see that Actions for Trans Health in some form were still around because there were some issues they had a few years ago. I'm very happy to see they are still around and still doing amazing work.
Good comrades.
And they were joined by representatives of the British Medical Association, as well as Dr. Brady, who is the government's LGBT senior advisor on these things, and he has always been on side. I think we're going to be diving into this whole inquiry more in depth in a future meat segment of our podcast once it wraps up. Because there is a lot to go through. But essentially the message is that trans people are being heard in this inquiry. And trans people have been giving loads of evidence. I've read a whole bunch more of the evidence that came out on the 11th, which I was just sort of catching up on before we started recording. And whilst there are dickheads being heard in this, the key thing to take away is we're being heard too. And I can't go into why I believe this specifically, but I know that at least half of the people on the committee are solid trans allies. and the other half aren't not. I just can't confirm it.
Yeah.
So, why do you think that this kind of thing doesn't necessarily get the coverage in the community?
I mean, it's the old adage, isn't it? Bad news sells. And so things that people will click on to... Well, I'm sure that people don't click on news like this with the specific intention of increasing their level of anxiety, but that is the result. And so all this stuff which is opposed to trans rights, to LGBT rights in general, is focused on kind of more than the good stuff that happens, and it's the bad news sells thing. And that's true at all times in all places, really, even for the LGBT media, which admittedly does publish more focused, celebratory, hey, here's some good news stuff more often than the mainstream media does, but it is still kind of something that it's just kind of how it works, I think.
Yeah, that definitely came up with this specific case. Now, I want to preface this with, I count people that work at Pink News and former people that work at Pink News as friends of mine.
Yes, indeed.
I have said many times I have worked there. I've worked there as a reporter, and I have now done a bit of freelancey stuff. Well, I've done one freelancey thing for them currently, and I hope to do more because they're great. And they have been nothing but supportive of the podcast, and I really like what they do.
Mm-hmm.
But when it came to reporting on this evidence inquiry, the report itself was really solid. They've definitely covered all the bases of this in a good news way. The headline itself was, Parliament is told that GICs are useless and should be shut down. And when I read that, my heart jumped out of my throat. Like I was freaking. And then I read the piece and I saw what happened. And other people online have mentioned similar. And I think, as much as I love Pink News, there is an issue there with their headlines, which are designed to get people's eyes, but maybe the people coming up with the headlines, which aren't always the same people as the people that write them.
Yes, indeed.
That's a thing that a lot of people don't know about the media. The editors a lot of the time come up with the headline rather than the writer of the copy itself. Yes. But it appeared that they were looking to get clicks, but weren't thinking about how that may affect the people that have the most on the line.
Indeed. And I mean, again, you and I know this, having, waded into media waters for years now. It's something that happens, which is that, someone will write a well-researched, excellent bit of copy, really good article, and then it gets given the most clickbaity possible headline. And again, we know why that is, because, the clue's in the name. It's the clickbait title. They want people to click on it. They want people to get eyes on it.
Yeah, and clickbait isn't always a bad thing. I think clickbait gets a lot of stick, but a lot of it is basically really good wording to incite interest, to get people to read stuff that is very important, which is something that Pink News has done. It's something that this podcast has done.
Well, tried to, at least.
Tried to and mostly failed, but, we try. But yeah, it's a very, very weird thing when you see someone that you, like an institution or an organization that you count as friends and allies, sort of making mistakes, and how you would address that. So I guess I want to say to the people at Pink News who may be listening, love you to death, love you, love what you do for the community, love how you've supported us in the past. And the issue is the headlines can sometimes make people feel really anxious and scared. And that's an issue that I think you need to work on there. Friend to friend.
Nice chummy little piece of advice. So can I ask you something? Yeah. What do you think about the premise of the argument that Action for Trans Health Durham presented to Parliament? What do you think about the idea of the GIC system not being fit for purpose and should be replaced with something?
I'm going to be coming from this as purely a personal thing, because I have not done as much as I could have to look into alternative avenues for healthcare. I've done as much reading as I think I can, and I still don't get all of the ins and outs of it, but it sounds solid. Because when I went to the clinic, and it's going to get a little bit personal, but not too much, I met a clinician at the what was Charing Cross Clinic. It's now the London Gender Identity Clinic. And essentially they said, you will not get hormones until you come out to your family. And I've mentioned before on the podcast, in too much detail at times, relationship with my family is very bad. Very bad, and has been very bad for a very long time, and including at that point. So they put me on a collision course with a horrible family situation or getting healthcare, and that struck me as wrong at the time, and it struck me as wrong now.
Yes.
And I emailed them to make a complaint about this, because I assumed this is the kind of thing that would have been fixed. But then I got an email saying that they still do this.
Yeah.
They still require you to come out to your family, no matter necessarily how dangerous it may be, to get healthcare. And I don't know of a single other place that does this in any healthcare field. It's not necessarily done in the States, I know that much. And this unnecessary having to prove your commitment to the process of transitioning is dangerous, and that came entirely from the UK GIC system, which has ignored best practice guidelines from the world forever because they wrote their own rule book and have been following that.
Yes.
So I think that Action for Trans Health are bang on when it should be GPs should be able to do this, and GPs should be encouraged to focus on best practice, because currently the gender identity clinics do not.
They do not.
In my experience. What's your take?
No, I'm absolutely with you. So this is obviously something I've experienced personally as well. Again, from the London Gender Clinic. I don't have quite the tempestuous relationship with my family and friends that you do.
Oh, my friends are great. I've got a wonderful relationship with my friends.
Yeah. The other people.
But I know what you're saying.
They're the people who got me through it, essentially. But it was a very. They have one set way of doing it, and any variation, they shall brook no argument. So they said, "Oh well, we'll give you funding for laser hair removal and your voice." And I was like, "Well, I like my voice. Why do I want to change that?" And I felt like I was being pushed into a particular route, not for my own medical and mental health needs, but for the comfort of cis people, to try and fit in by, training myself to do a different voice, so I would, quote unquote, pass better. Now, obviously, there's the personal experience that I've got there, but also the professional experience of dealing with people who've had to go through this system. I've been volunteering around Manchester and with the LGBT Foundation, that organisation for years. In Manchester now, there is an initiative called Indigo Clinic, which is based on providing as much healthcare as possible to trans people in a primary care setting. It's not having to go to a specific clinic and sit, and go there every 6, 3 or 12 months to basically tell the same story and have several conversations that very easily could have been a telephone call. Indigo are doing telephone calls and Zoom calls and saying, well, we're not going to, ring fence all of the stuff in terms of trans healthcare. We're not going to say you can only get your prescription for this or that or this kind of treatment from us. We are going to start farming that out to your GPs, to primary care, so that it kind of diffuses everything throughout, a much wider healthcare system, rather than saying, no, you must come to us and only us for this kind of treatment, which of course is what's causing the astonishing bottleneck and waiting times. So in a sense, that healthcare model is already in place up here in the Northwest, and there are, it shouldn't be particularly shocking for the government to hear that we don't think that the GIC service is fit for purpose. It isn't. It's ridiculous. You have to wait. It's humiliating. It's invasive. And it is simply because, as you've already said, the British gender clinicians from back in the 60s and 70s decided to write their own rule book and have stuck rigidly to it ever since. So I, as you say, will do a proper meet about this, this inquiry, the scope of it, the people that spoke to it. I'm sure we will highlight all the good stuff that was said, and we will dunk on all the dodgy stuff that was said, because that's what we do here at What the Trans.
And there really is some wonderful stuff to dunk on. I read some of the submissions by the anti-trans lot, and some of them are horrifying, and we won't be going into those ones, but some of them are quite frankly fucking hilarious.
Yeah, indeed. And it's like, what, which reality are you in? Because it's not the same one as me. Anyway, so moving on.
Yeah, that's enough of the news for now. Let's get on to the meat. So here is the meat of the episode, which is our interview with Stonewall CEO Nancy Kelley. Now, Stonewall and the trans community, our relationship has been fraught for most of Stonewall's existence. However, 6 years ago, Stonewall announced that they are going to fight for trans rights. And since then, I believe they have done some wonderful things. Currently, the status of Stonewall in the LGBT community goes without saying to trans listeners and LGBT listeners in general. They are the big dogs in this. And so getting this interview on this tiny podcast, I think, is a good sign that Stonewall want to reach out to the trans community, because who are we? Really? we're like one of a few things out there that are entirely based on talking to trans people and not entirely about, talking to cis people and changing people's minds and advancing our rights. We are an information delivery service via jokes and snark to the trans community, and that is our founding principle and our goal and our only goal. So for the CEO of Stonewall to give us time is definitely a sign in itself that Stonewall want to communicate with the trans community via us or via any number of trans-led organisations.
Indeed.
Which we are.
Yeah,
even though it's just like a few of us in bedrooms.
Yeah, it's an organisation of, it's a very flat team structure. But no, it was great to get this interview, and I think we were pretty astonished when they said yes. That you can have an interview with the CEO. What, are you kidding? Are you sure? But it was honestly, I had a very, very nice. We had a great conversation, didn't we? It was really good to sit down to someone, and she knows the score, she knows the stuff. She's got her head screwed on. Nearly said she's got her head screwed on straight, but that's probably not quite. Not straight, directly, firmly, let's say.
Yeah, she does say in the interview that she loves being a lesbian.
Yeah.
And so I think saying that she's got her head screwed on straight is probably doing her a massive disservice.
Right? So let's say head screwed on firmly. That seems to be more of a...
Head screwed on queer.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, so without further ado, let us play the tape. Here is our interview with the Chief Exec of Stonewall, Nancy Kelley. Take it away, Us in the Past. First of all, thank you very much for sitting down with us. Nancy Kelley, Chief Exec of Stonewall. Delighted to have you with us for this little chat. So first of all, let's get straight into it. What has Stonewall been doing on trans issues that a lot of people perhaps wouldn't be aware of?
I'm kind of guessing what people might not have heard about, but I'll give this a go. So our trans inclusion team is doing a fantastic piece of work called Transforming Futures that's working with trans community organisations and trans people themselves to think about how do we reimagine the health system for trans people? How do we reimagine the way the criminal justice system works for trans people? So I think not everybody would have heard about that. We do a lot of work around hate crime and hate speech. So particularly our colleagues in Stonewall Scotland have been really successful recently in ensuring that trans people are protected in new hate speech laws in Scotland, and also getting rid of some really transphobic amendments that were put forward for that legislation. We've started to build up a really significant strategic litigation programme, working in partnership with people like Good Law Project. So intervening in really important cases that protect and promote trans rights. So we've applied, for instance, to intervene in the Gender X passport cases before the UK Supreme Court.
The Christie Ellen Kane
That's
case.
right, yeah. So we're waiting for confirmation that we've got permission to intervene. We're doing that with gendered intelligence. And then maybe globally, just an example of something that people might not be aware of. So in our global team, we've got a fantastic project called Out of the Margins that works with lesbian, bi and trans women's organisations in 24 different countries around the world. So to support those human rights defenders to do research and advocacy on the experiences of LGBT women. So those are some of the things that we're doing that kind of might not be as visible.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I think I put that question together because from talking to listeners, there's a lot of reports from places about certain things that affect the trans community, but there are definitely some things that Stonewall do that don't get the attention they deserve. So I'll provide links for information on everything you've mentioned for our listeners in the description. But to get into some things that have been going on recently, Stonewall recently released a report on trans conversion therapy. Did any of your findings from that surprise you?
I wish I could say yes, but the truth is no. I think we were expecting to see that trans people were at a really elevated risk of being subjected to those abusive practices. And I think we were expecting to see also that Black and Asian LGBTQ people were particularly at risk as well. I guess what I find most troubling around the kind of conversation we're having around conversion therapy at the minute is the way in which there are actors, whether they're anti-trans actors or religious actors, that are prepared to argue in favour of being able to continue to abuse people, and perhaps particularly those people that are attempting to say that it should continue to be legal to send trans children to people who advertise conversion therapy. So I guess it didn't surprise me. I wish it did. But what does surprise me is that there are people that are prepared to publicly argue for the right to abuse trans communities.
Yeah, I should point out that the report itself does not report on how necessarily widespread it is, but it was a survey of a limited number of trans people. But the thing that definitely surprised me the most was something like 10% of the respondents said that their conversion therapy took place in their home by family members.
Yeah, I mean, so we know from other surveys that have been done, like the government's national LGBT survey, that trans people are about twice as likely to be subjected to conversion therapy as cis people are, right? So we know it from other sources. I think the thing about conversion therapy that's important to maybe think through is that this is not about intention. Right. So if you're subjected to conversion therapy practices by a parent who loves you but is super transphobic, it's super harmful. If you're subjected to conversion therapy practices by a religious leader who thinks they're doing the right thing, it's super harmful. So this is a form of harm and abuse to trans people that's taking place in spaces that should be safe, as well as in kind of medical or pseudo-psychotherapeutic contexts. It's taking place in communities, it's taking place in families, it's taking place in churches and faith institutions.
When I was reading through the report, as you say, I wish I could be surprised by it. Some of it was precisely what you might have thought of. But as you said, it's very daunting and galling, really, that there are people who say, no, this is fine and we should be allowed to carry on doing it when it is demonstrably not. Anyway, when it comes to the government, how open do you think they've been about listening to Stonewall? Have you been approached by the Johnson government at all?
So we're lucky or fortunate in some ways in that, because we're kind of part of a kind of group of reasonably well-known organisations, we get some time with the government. And that's kind of part of what Stonewall was set up to do, right? So we were set up to kind of lobby on behalf of a wider movement, and we do that. I don't think we've had nearly as much engagement from this government as we have had from previous governments, including previous Conservative governments. And I think the risk around a lack of engagement is that you have a lot of ignorance. So kind of the trans community, as you know, is a really small community. There is a lot of kind of really extreme misinformation promulgated, particularly online, and having space to engage with politicians, with leaders, with, you know, people with big public platforms, with the media is really important to help kind of unpick some of the misinformation that people have consumed in really large volumes. And so I think one of the issues that we've faced is with, although we have had engagement, and when we do engage, government engages reasonably positively or in reasonably good faith, there isn't enough really to unpack some of this kind of mountain of misinformation about trans people in their lives. So we would love to have stronger engagement from the government as Stonewall. We would love for them to be engaging more strongly with the movement. We would love most of all for them to be listening more to trans people directly. And I think those are all things that we advocate for.
As I've been doing this work for a while and been watching the government very closely, the impression that I'm getting is that they want to appear to be good on LGBT issues whilst doing as little as possible. And as an example, I could name how very recently I was approaching the Government and Equalities Office press office asking about how Liz Truss was saying that the government were improving trans healthcare. And I identified this as a lie because she was referring to 3 pilot scheme gender clinics that were actually commissioned by NHS England and not the government, because the government don't commission NHS services. And that left me cold. I basically decided that I was never going to deal with the Government Equalities Office press office ever again, because they were effectively trying to sell me a lie. And I think a lot of trans people listening to this will feel not only let down, but actively attacked by the government. Mm-hmm. I've spoken to many trans people whilst doing this, many trans people, and they have the distinct impression that the Boris Johnson government especially, and Liz Truss, are enemies of the trans community. Would you agree with that assessment?
So I kind of think it doesn't matter what they believe, it matters what they do. Right. So I think the question here is there a kind of programme of work that is improving the position of trans people in the UK that the government is putting forward? And the answer to that is right now, I would say no. So I think focusing on, are we seeing meaningful, both kind of investment in thinking about and forming, and then financial investment in a healthcare system that is inclusive of trans people, and in a healthcare system that provides great quality person-centered transition-related care? No, we are not. Are we seeing kind of really big steps forward around, for instance, trans inclusion in schools? We're seeing some steps. It's an area where we're seeing some positive improvements, like things like inclusive RHSE. But are we seeing what we need to see to make all trans kids safe in schools? No, we are not. So I think for me, it's about, with politicians and governments, whoever they are, it's about what you do, not what you say, and not what you think in the privacy of your own home. So I kind of share the perspective that the government is not kind of investing enough in improving the lives of trans people in the UK, and that's what we talk about when we talk to them.
Okay, cool. So moving on to the next question. Liz Truss in the community is not liked. I'm going to be blunt. Mostly around last year, when it was very clear from the outside, and also hearing from sources, that she was really gunning for what was essentially a ban on trans women and women's spaces. She was really looking to reduce the provision of unisex toilets, and also to reduce access to trans healthcare for young people. Do you think Liz Truss is fit for purpose as the Minister for Women and Equality?
I'm going to give you a bit of a politician's answer. And I guess what I would say, and we've said this publicly to the Women in Equality Select Committee inquiry, is that we think equalities needs a cabinet post of its own. So whoever the post holder has been, and that, you know, this would include the current post holder, it has been incredibly difficult for them to do such an important job well, on top of a massive other day job. So in this case, this is the Secretary of State for the Department for International Trade, at a point where we're attempting to renegotiate trade deals with the entire world. So I think for me, what we need is a Minister for Equalities for whom their day job is being a Minister for Equalities. And we need to have someone that is therefore able to really get invested in creating more equal outcomes for all of us, and being able to learn and being able to understand and being able to work with communities much more effectively. That's the thing that would make the biggest difference, not any given change of personnel, actually, I think.
I'm sure you'll have an opinion on this. What do you think is behind the recent wave of anti-trans organisations, of which there are many, of course, springing out of the ground?
So I think that there is a kind of bigger issue maybe to think about, or not a bigger issue, but a much bigger problem, which is a bit depressing, which is the global anti-gender movement. So this is something that kind of starts through mid-1990s onwards, opposition to kind of UN-led initiatives that improve the rights of women around, so sexual and reproductive rights basically at the UN. And from then on, you start to see incredible organization around opposition to sexual and reproductive rights agendas globally, and the kind of evangelical religious right in the US, and kind of anti-marriage, etc. And so that global anti-gender movement is investing enormous amounts of money and resource around the world in organizations or little groupings and online advocacy that attacks, in some places, LGBT people. So think Poland, think Hungary, think some parts of Africa, where it's very much kind of LGBT and trans people. And then in countries like the UK, really focuses on trans as a wedge issue. And the reason why I think it's important to kind of think about that, the bigger global network, is you see all of this exchange, not just of money, but of ideas and tactics. So for instance, in the wave of anti-trans lawsuits in the US at the minute, they were citing the Kira Bell judgment. So there's a big global problem. And I think that one of the big challenges for the movement, and for Stonewall specifically, is how do we collaborate globally to fight it? I think there are local variations of that. So the UK has kind of developed and exports a anti-trans playbook that kind of spreads across left and right political divides in a particular way, that uses certain parts of radical feminist thinking more than was the case, say, in some countries. So we've got a distinctive flavour, if that makes sense, but we're part of a kind of bigger network of people that are really working around a highly regressive agenda globally.
Yeah, indeed, I absolutely agree. And I think the main question that I've asked myself while this has been happening over the last few years, and those links are clear with the Heritage Foundation, the Alliance Defending Freedom in the US, and other groups from other countries, like, where do these people get their money from, you know? Like, because if we were funded half a quarter as well as this lot seem
Yeah.
to be, we'd be a lot further along. Being a little bit more specific and kind of zeroing in on something in particular from the recent news, what is your take on the LGB Alliance receiving charity status from the Charity Commission?
So it was incredibly distressing to hear that an organisation that spends essentially its entire time denigrating trans people and anyone who supports them was being given charity status. And I think that's just important to say. And I know how devastating that has been for the trans community to feel like institutions are kind of recognizing and validating an organization that really spends its entire time attacking the community. I also feel quite conscious, and kind of conversion therapy is a kind of good example here, that there are a lot of quite poisonous organisations that have got charity status.
Fair point.
Yeah, that is something that I was trying to get out to people, that there are some charities out there that really are. You would be very surprised to discover that they have the charity number at the bottom of their webpage.
Yes, so there are some conversion therapy providers, for instance, that have charitable status. And that doesn't make it better.
So much charity.
So charity, yeah.
So
charity.
charity.
So charity. But it's kind of important to have at least that understanding. What I also feel about it, I guess, is that it's very clear from the announcement the Charity Commission made that they took very serious issue with the social media presence of that organisation, which is what most of that organisation is.
Yeah.
And they've given a clear undertaking effectively in exchange for the charitable status that they will change their pattern of engagement around denigrating trans people on social media, or at least that's how I read the announcement from the Charity Commission. So I think it's important that they're held to the standards that a charity should be held to about undermining and attacking protected groups, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear. I mean, I've been following them from the start, and you were bang on when you said they're basically a social media account, because when they first started, they were a social media account, and then they had all of this press coverage and everything else, and it's just been astonishing to see how they seem to have become a go-to place for a lot of media outlets to go to, and they may have been aiming for that entirely to justify that side of things. But when it comes to the LGB Alliance, do you believe that they represent any part of the LGBT community?
Yes, because some lesbian, gay and bi people are transphobic, sadly. I don't think it's a majority. I don't think it's even a big minority. But in exactly the same way that kind of racism, sexism, all of these other oppressions exist inside our community as well as outside of it, there are some transphobic lesbians, there are some transphobic bi people and gay people who are cis. What is completely wrong is to say that's the majority view. Definitely isn't. And what I find personally really offensive is the idea that kind of being a lesbian, so I'm a cis lesbian, I love being a lesbian, I love lesbians, I've enjoyed Lesbian Visibility Week greatly. The way in which I think they try and present transphobia as a kind of entry requirement for being a cis LGB person, which is just not true at all. It's not reflective of who we are. It's not what our community is. So kind of they don't get to define what being a lesbian is or what being a gay man is any more than they get to define what being a woman is, right?
Yeah, I've talked to some cis LGB people about this very recently, and definitely the feeling is, there is a feeling of, how dare they say they represent my sexuality and my needs? That's definitely an impression I've been getting from people.
And I think there are way more people that feel like that than that are kind of super engaged in transphobic thinking, you know?
Oh, no doubt. Like, I live in lefty London and all of that, you know, but I don't think I've ever seen an LGBT, whatever space that hasn't been inclusive of trans people, supportive of trans people in some way. Like, they very much are a complete outlier from where I'm standing.
And I think there's a really important point there, right? So the idea that gets kind of pushed, I guess, in kind of public conversation or in the media is that kind of trans people have popped up out of nowhere, and you know the civil rights movement around LGBT issues has been led by cis people, which is bullshit, right? So the LGBT rights movement, you know, around the world and in this country has always been kind of trans and cis people together. You know, GLF, there were people right from the beginning of the Gay Liberation Front that were trans people, that were activists within that movement, that famously trans people in the Stonewall riots. This is the same as everywhere, right? We've always been a we. So the idea that there should be this kind of complete separation between cis LGB people and trans people, whatever their sexuality, that's the novelty, That's the new idea. And it's an oppressive and offensive and harmful one.
They very much are using the same playbook. I mean, certainly the press are using the same playbook that was levelled at, gay and bisexual people 20, 30 years ago. They're just saying literally the same things and aiming them at trans people. And I'm astonished that more people aren't noticing that, because there's been at least one cis gay person that I've known who was kind of taken in by it because they just kind of hadn't done the research and didn't spend a lot of time in that sphere. And I was like, no. Let me explain you a thing, which I did politely, which I was quite impressed with myself. Anyway, moving on. Okay, so closer to home then, let's talk about Stonewall. What's the biggest myth about Stonewall that your detractors have?
I love this question so much. So the biggest myth about Stonewall, which I like, or it's a set of myths I like to collectively refer to as #Stonewall Deep State, is the kind of idea that we are this incredibly powerful organization that is able to make governments and big companies and everybody kind of, kind of individual humans, we kind of brainwash them and we're able to control what people do and think in this incredible, I mean, it's amazing what people think Stonewall can do. And the thing that I find just, I guess, amazing about it is if we did have that power, then we would not have the level of transphobia that we have in this country. If indeed we were kind of all powerful kind of mega minds controlling everything, we wouldn't be a country that is famous around the world for having a transphobic press. And, we wouldn't be a country where LGBT people of colour experience kind of hideous oppression on the basis of the combination of racism and homophobia and transphobia. We wouldn't be a country where kids are still going to school every day and getting bullied for being LGBT, right? But that is the kind of biggest myth, that we're controlling everything. You'll know when I'm controlling everything.
Right? Like, if only.
It would be great fun for all sorts of reasons, like way less oppression, way more cake and biscuits if I was running the world.
And if you could bring back video arcades, I'd be very happy. Is that something Stonewall could do?
I'll give it my best shot, Michelle. That just for you.
We'll add it to the list, comrade.
Yeah, I just miss being able to go down and play whatever Street Fighter game they have out with my friends. That's just something I really miss. But
that's showing your age now, I think. Anyway,
so how do you deal with misleading or lies about Stonewall that get reported in the media? Like, I mean, as an example, this was not under your tenure, but one of the big ones that I looked at was when the LGB Alliance was forming, and because one founder of Stonewall signed a letter in the Times, that became the basis for saying that the LGB Alliance is splitting from Stonewall, giving this false impression that Stonewall in the office had split in half, and a lot of people walked out when that didn't happen. Like, how do you and how does Stonewall deal with these misleading or outright lies when they get into the press?
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a bit more broadly than that as well, because we also do the majority of the work that we do around misleading press coverage is around misleading press coverage of trans people and the trans community. And we also obviously try and do work around people telling whoppers about Stonewall, but that's kind of the lesser important thing in my mind. I guess there's like a few different ways that we work on this. So when people produce content that is transphobic or that's misleading or that doesn't provide any opportunity for trans people to speak, our media team will very commonly just reach out to the people that made the piece and say, look, it would have been great for you to have also reflected this, or we noticed that you said this, but also here's the link to the actual evidence. This is the case. So we do a lot of kind of quiet day-to-day work to just try and coach and correct people's misunderstandings. We do sometimes make formal complaints, but we try not to because they don't make as big of a difference as maybe over time trying to just gently kind of drip feed, actually, this isn't quite right, or this is in some cases really not right.
When you're talking about doing complaints, you're talking about reporting to IPSO or citing the editor's code?
Yeah. So we do sometimes do that, but we would probably spend our entire time doing formal complaints about media coverage of trans people if we did a formal complaint every time. So we also try and just informally raise it directly with the journalist concerned and say, okay, you wrote this piece and it kind of platformed this person, but you didn't make it clear that that person doesn't have the relevant expertise, or you gave this perspective but you didn't provide a perspective from a trans person, or those sorts of things. And we do the same when people say things that are inaccurate about us. So we'll kind of say, you've said some version of Stonewall deep state conspiracy theory, this is in fact factually incorrect, can you not do that and or apologize? But we also do work to talk to editors or to commissioners to try and help them understand the trans community better, often in partnership with trans-led organizations. So we do kind of a lot of positive work, if that makes sense, to just try and lay the ground. And it's a bit of an uphill struggle, because we do have a mainstream press that is really marked by kind of transphobia at the editorial level, I would say. But it's important, right? So you kind of grind week in, week out to try and keep saying, let's have a conversation, let's expose you to more viewpoints, let's expose you to more actual engagement with trans people, let's ask you why you aren't commissioning trans journalism. So there's a lot of kind of drip feed stuff that we do that I think is the thing that will make the biggest difference in the end.
Yeah, I think you have an uphill battle, because I've been very vocal about this. I even got a piece in Pink News where I basically make this argument. Transphobia makes people money. These transphobic reports happen for a reason, and that reason is they get eyes. You portray this community as a danger or taking something away from the majority, people will look at that, people will debate it in the comments, people will debate it on Twitter, social media, get cash in on it. It's just this whole system of people cashing in on brutalising a community. And I'm just saying, I think you've got a real uphill struggle there, because it's just, I mean, how do you fight the forces of capitalism and greed on that level?
At a really obvious level, a really basic level, it's a shrinking market, right? So if you look at public attitudes to trans people, firstly, they're way, way more positive than you would think, given what our media sounds like.
Oh yeah, the YouGov polls, I'll be linking to those in the description, listeners, so don't worry about that.
Yeah, and I used to also work on the British Social Attitude Survey in my last job, and it kind of shows the same thing, right? So public attitudes are much, much more positive than you would think based on the kind of coverage in the media. When you look at those breakdowns by age, and you look at what kind of 18 to 25-year-olds, 18 to 30-year-olds think about LGBT inclusion generally, and trans people specifically, they've got really distinctive positive attitudes. So from that really hard-edged commercial perspective that you're pointing at, Michelle, there is a counter argument that says, if you want anybody under the age of 30 to read your content, you need to start thinking about the fact that for that generation, although there are, of course, transphobes in that generation, just as there are radical trans advocates who are 70, right? But for that generation, the pattern of attitudes is very, very different. And some of the things that you are saying are completely kind of unacceptable. I mean, there are moral arguments, it's wrong. There are journalistic arguments, totally inaccurate. And there are commercial arguments, your market is going to shrink.
That makes sense. I should try and maybe focus on that more.
It's a long game, isn't it?
It's the long game.
Sadly. Which over time, it's one of the only ones that works, sadly, as difficult as it is. So thank you for that. Slightly closer to home, I guess, and not wishing to offend you. But there is a perception among many within the trans community that certain organisations, including Stonewall, have gone a bit quiet on trans issues specifically to avoid getting heat from the press. So what's your opinion on that mindset?
So people feel what they feel, right? And at a time when the trans community is under such attack so persistently, there is nothing about that feeling that I want to say that feeling isn't validated. I'm sure it's totally natural to feel like, where are the voices that are standing up for us, right? Because there are so many voices shouting so loudly and being platformed so much. So on that level, it's not wrong to have the feeling. I would say that a huge amount of work that we do, particularly in terms of the media output that we do, or the attempts to engage with the media, is very much focused on trans people and trans rights. I think we don't always get quoted. So we provide a lot of input, but we don't always get our input used as well, is also another point to kind of make. But it does form a very significant part of the media facing work, certainly that Stonewall does and will. I think for me, it's very clear to me coming into this job as chief exec that protecting and progressing the rights of trans people and improving the day-to-day lived experience of trans people is an absolutely core part part of my job. So we're not going to stop standing up for trans people. We know that that is completely central to our mission as an organisation. We do absolutely everything we can with the press and can't always control what comes out the other end.
Yeah, it has its own way of working, doesn't it? The hydra that it is.
I do spend a lot of time reading the press for doing this, and what you said does make sense, because there are very much times where I have read about Stonewall without hearing anything from Stonewall in the report, and I very much thought, have they just not asked? Like, you have to get a right of reply, surely, or what happened there?
Both things. Sometimes they ask and we give input and it's not liked and not used, and sometimes they don't ask.
Ah, well, that's just great.
Yeah, wonderful. Free press, yo.
So, before we get to some questions from listeners, basically I talk to people every day. Every day I get a message from somebody in the trans community asking me something. It's very, very strange, because I don't see myself as any kind of expert on a lot of things, but, I'm a bit prominent in the community, so I guess that's just what happens. But the impression I'm getting is that, and actually from my own experience, things have been pretty bad for trans people for a long time now. The media response has definitely filtered down onto the ground in people's lives, and I get the sense that there are many trans people who really want to fight back. Talking to some of them, they're ready. They're just looking for someone to point them in the right direction, but they are unsure of what specifically to do. As someone with experience in this area, as someone who's done the activism thing for a while now, you're the CEO of Stonewall. What would you say are the best things trans people could do to fight back? Like, if you imagine that there is a listener at home, maybe in a group of trans people, like a social group of some kind, but they're not really that connected. They're in a small town somewhere. They may not be in a city like London where it may be easier. What could they do in their local community, do you think, that would improve things or help to improve things?
So I guess there's a couple of things from my perspective, although I'm conscious that I'm teaching my granddaughters and grandsons to suck eggs, maybe. Firstly, just getting by and thriving is so important. So before we even talk about like activism or extra stuff, I think trans people living their fullest life and being happy is like the most radical act right now. And so if they're doing that in their town or their village, then they are doing something that is a form of activism. They are being trans people, living their lives, loving themselves, being visible. All of that is massive. And I just want to really say that. I think in terms of other things to think about, there are, as you know, and as loads of your listeners will know, tons of absolutely fantastic trans community organisations that do different types of work. The key thing here is like we've all got different parts to play in the movement. Stonewall plays a particular part as an LGBT voluntary sector organisation, organisations like the Trans Safety Network, Transactual, Trans Media Watch, all of these organisations are playing really important and different and complementary roles in podcasts like What the Trans. It's all good work for the movement, and we all need all of it to kind of move forward, if that makes sense. So I think it's good for people to think about what is it that I feel I've got the best affinity for, that I feel I can offer, and get involved with a kind of trans community organisation that does that kind of work, or get involved with an LGBT organisation that does that kind of work, because there isn't one good way to do activism, and all of those forms of activism are helping. I think there's a big challenge on us about how we work together more fluidly across all of those boundaries, how we as a movement collaborate more effectively, but I think there's so much incredible work being done for people to get involved with. The other thing just to shout out to, which kind of people sometimes often don't think of as activism or social change, but is really important. So kind of one of the things that we know about how prejudiced attitudes change is that pretty much the most successful way of changing a prejudiced attitude is through direct contact, and actually weirdly through working with people. So it's called social contact theory, and there's a lot of studies in this about kind of race, for instance, where people feel able to be advocates in their own workplace, where people feel able to be visible in their own workplace or in their own community. That can feel like a less kind of glamorous form of activism, but it's that makes the difference to what actual people think. I think that sort of very grassroots, doing a talk at your local school, doing a talk at your local hospital, just being out in your workplace if it's safe for you to be out in your workplace. Those are the things that also make a big difference. And collectively, all of those micro interactions make transphobia less acceptable, and it make it less appealing as a kind of political strategy.
I didn't want to announce specifically who we were speaking to until we got the interview done, just in case, technical issues or something got in the way or something, that's how things can go weird. So I asked people for questions of what they would like to know from a major LGBT organization, and we got inundated. Like, I was expecting to get 2 or 3 questions, and we got like 20. I've pushed them down to 3.
Yeah, we picked 3, didn't we?
And the first one from Jacob Edwards is, how many trans people work for Stonewall?
So I'm not going to give you a number, but I can give you a percentage. So it's at the minute, it's 17% of our staff. We'd like to improve that, and we're working to improve that. But today at Stonewall, 17% of our staff are trans.
I mean, that's much better than you'd get in most organisations, I suspect. Obviously, the fact it's an LGBT organisation is going to be having an influence there, but that's great to hear.
Yeah, that's a significant number. I do get the impression from people I talk to, some of who have worked at Stonewall, some do, and some other people who would know that trans people tend to be in the room when these things are discussed. Is that the case, would you say?
Yeah, I think we try and make sure that we get the right balance between inclusion and not asking people to do too much emotional labour that isn't part of their paid job. So kind of not all of that 17% work in kind of campaigns focused roles. And so we try and make sure that we're developing our strategies with trans colleagues, but we're not asking them to do stuff that's distressing or that's not their day job when they're not volunteering for it. So I think that's kind of also part of the mix. What I would also say, if it's okay to plug, is we are always incredibly welcoming of applications for jobs that we've got vacant, and we're incredibly welcoming of applications from trans people from all kinds of backgrounds. Got lots of good jobs going at the minute. Come work with us, push the number up, but it's 17% at the minute.
I'll include a link to your jobs page in the description.
Thank you.
Paula, if you're looking for a job, throw your hat over the wall, try Stonewall.
So this next question is from Crit Facts. And the question is, what are your priorities and why? And what do you see as most urgent short-term and most beneficial long-term? So there's a lot in that question.
There's a lot in that. So I might narrow it a bit. So I'm going to talk specifically around kind of trans rights and trans people's experiences. And I'm going to kind of do things that feel urgent and then maybe, but which also need tackling long-term, because that's the problem. Some of the urgent is long work. There's urgent and important. I'll have a go. I think there is a real urgency around kind of building much stronger solidarities across movements in response to the kind of global anti-gender movement and the anti-trans movement we've got in the UK. So working with LGBT rights organisations around the world, but also working with anti-racist organisations, women's rights organisations, those sorts of things. That's definitely an urgent and will take a while, but hopefully not long term, not with us forever. One of the other things that I feel is really urgent is around transition related healthcare. I mean, I think it is accurate to say it is a failed service in the UK at the minute for children and adults. You know, I think that one of the issues with transition related healthcare is that it has been so bad for so long that you kind of get tricked into thinking that saying it's failed is awful. But if you think about kind of in what other area would we accept such enormous waiting lists? In what other area would we accept such a complete lack of person-centered care? And I think there are great pilots going on, like Indigo, some of the work at 16th Street, etc., etc. And I think there is an urgent need to just kind of completely retool transition-related healthcare into something that's primary care led, that's person-centered, that's accessible to people, and that feels urgent. Not a quick fix, but absolutely urgent to me. And I guess there is a kind of urgency for me around safety, which we've been touching on. So that kind of hate speech, hate crime, community level safety piece, because we've seen kind of hate crime against trans people rising. Some of the things that you were both pointing to around the way in which some of the media landscape is enabling real life transphobia. So those are 3 things that feel really urgent to me. I think that important, in addition to the urgent, I've always got very long to-do lists. I'm one of those people. So I think kind of really moving the dial on workplace inclusion for trans people, on making it possible for trans people everywhere to kind of have really fulfilling work lives as well as safe work lives. I think taking a big step forward around trans inclusion in schools so that trans kids and trans teachers can feel really safe to be who they are and to learn in all educational environments. I think kind of longer term, there is a big piece of work to do around gender recognition. I don't just mean Gender Recognition Act. I mean all of the ways in which kind of official documentation forces us to be gendered or forces us to be gendered in a particular way. And that is over the long term something that I think is important. So if you think about things like Gender X passports case, etc., you know, that is something that matters. It's not a crisis in the way that I think transition related healthcare feels like a system in crisis, but it does matter that trans people experience such kind of profound erasure and disrespect respect around all of the ways in which the state records identity.
Yeah, there was a debate that we talked about last week on the pod around non-binary recognition. I was on the train for a long time. It's a stain on the British society. We don't have legal recognition for non-binary people. What the hell is that? And then I was told by many non-binary people, actually, should we try and go for gender recognition abolition? Because how are we going to go to a country that harms trans people with a passport that says, essentially, I'm non-binary?
Yeah.
And that was a very compelling point to me. What's your take on that?
I think it's really important to think about these things, isn't it? So in terms of gender X passports, we as an organisation are in favour of the option for X or null, so nothing. And one of the things I think is quite interesting about no gender marker is there's lots of people that would like no gender marker. I wouldn't like. I get gendered constantly, officially, unnecessarily, and it hacks me off bluntly and always has.
Yeah, me too.
So we have a lot of unnecessary legal gendering that happens. And so I think a really important question to think about is, how do we create a system where people who don't want to be gendered in certain contexts don't have to be gendered, and where people who want to be gendered can be gendered in a way that feels respectful to them and recognizing of them? And how do we really be careful about recognizing the context in which official gendering is actually needed versus the context in which it's a kind of custom and practice that's developed in a world that was completely dominated by kind of binary, cisnormative, heteronormative thinking?
It's difficult to... I mean, I'm agreeing with you a lot. I realise that.
You're allowed to agree with me.
I know, but...
There is sometimes a pressure when you're doing the journalism thing to be like, right, I got to find the most combative thing possible to say here. But then I don't really like doing that. It's probably why I was never able to make it work in the real journalism world and doing it. And so I had to make my own outlet to find my own way to do it. But yeah, Ashley, have you got the last listener's question?
I do. I will take the final question, so you're nearly off the hook, don't worry. And this question is from Callum Henderson. And again, it's kind of a multi-part question. Has Stonewall looked into the treatment of trans people on social media? Has Stonewall taken any action on the hate aimed at trans people by talking to those who operate social media platforms?
Yeah, just to say, Callum's question was definitely echoed by a large number of people that we asked. This is very much a concern of a lot of people at the moment.
So I'll answer the question backwards. So yes, we have and do talk to social media platforms around how they can do better in terms of user safety and in terms of content moderation, because they're related but not kind of completely identical overlapping areas. And we work also with partners like Glitch that have that are really interested and have specialisms around kind of online safety as well. So, yes, that is a part of the work that we do. I think what we haven't done is dedicated research around, for instance, the experience of online hate by trans people. My own feeling is that we desperately need more kind of technical academic research in this space, because tracking online hate well is kind of beyond our ken as Stonewall, kind of all really kind of fancy kind of network analysis is what you need. Because what you see, and everybody listening will know this, is prolific networks that are involve instigators, involve bots, involve networks of organizations. And I think what we need is like much greater clarity about how that world is functioning, how people are being radicalized into online transphobia, how the kind of trolling machine is working. And I think it would be great to see a lot more kind of technical social media research in that space. And we would certainly want to support it, and we would want to use it, because it is very, very visible how unsafe many platforms are for trans people.
All right, well, that was the last question. So thank you so much, Nancy Kelley, for your time and for chatting to us today. Perhaps we'll speak again soon.
I hope so. Thanks for having me.
So that was our chat with Nancy Kelley, CEO of Stonewall, and all-round very nice person to talk to. Ash, what was your takeaways from our chat?
Well, as you say, she's certainly very, very nice. You can kind of see why she's in the position that she's in. That she had a lot of stuff kind of just in her head that she was just able to just talk about straight off the bat. I think when you and I were chatting just afterwards, but before we started recording this, the word savvy came up, and that's a really good summation of it, I think. And I'm happy to see, how her leadership goes and where it goes, and the things that Stonewall will be engaging in the future. some of which she mentioned, obviously, and some of which she could not.
Yeah, I've definitely got a bunch of things that I'm going to be keeping tabs on, setting up some internet alerts for when those phrases and stuff come up. But what I was really happy about was her highlighting other initiatives in the trans community, like Trans Safety Network and people like that. I was surprised, to be honest with you. I didn't expect that.
Because so often, and speaking as someone who's had years of experience to get all cynical and jaded about this, but so often organisations, particularly big ones in the charity oeuvre, can kind of work in silos and just kind of think, oh, well, you should support us, you should lend your support to us, and blah, blah, blah. I think culturally that is changing, but the fact that the CEO of arguably the largest LGBT charity in the UK is aware of these very, very grassroots things and is supportive of them is absolutely a good sign.
Yeah, and the thing that I've been thinking a lot recently is this idea of, do things have to be slow? That's something that I've been very much thinking about a lot, because the way I have been thinking about things is that when it comes to the activism work and where the trans community are now, there has been an opinion that I have heard from people in organisations of various kinds and outside as well, that change is inevitable, yet it is slow. And kind of the people on the ground suffering now, they're kind of got to be left behind as the cost of doing business. And that is something that I vehemently disagreed with, almost entirely based on reading a lot of Captain America, weirdly, because his whole thing has been like, there's a deeper philosophical things, but to put it in pop terms, Captain America is more on the virtue ethics end of things, whereas Iron Man is more on the utilitarian end of things, which means that he does things that are good no matter what. A good example being in the movie where he's like, no, we don't trade lives, Vision's not dying or whatever. But when you hear from the other side of things on how trans people in their own lives can make positive changes on the micro scale, well, on the macro scale in their lives, but on the micro scale when it comes to the big picture, by living as best as they can, by joining other smaller groups, by being an advocate wherever they can in their own lives, that made me change things up slightly in a way that there are ways to make things better right now. There are absolutely ways to make things better right now, and I just wasn't necessarily seeing them because I was too focused on the big picture. So it's given me a lot to think about. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I've always, in all the work that I've done volunteering for years and years, it's always kind of been about the long game for me, because that has previously seemed to be the only thing that produces any results. You make connections and you educate people, and it's a slow process. But as anybody who's involved themselves with that work for any amount of time will tell you, it is frustratingly slow. And actually, you do start asking yourself the question, why is this so difficult? Why is this taking so long? It's, we're not asking for anything particularly out there. We just want some really basic stuff. Where is it? I pay my taxes. Where is it? I'm a citizen of this country who's subject to the rights and protections of everybody else, so why am I not receiving them? And those questions do loom large, justifiably so. And I think there is nothing wrong with asking the question, well, why? Why is this taking so long? Because so often organisations and governments will absolutely say, oh yeah, we'll deal with that, we'll deal with that in due course kind of thing, to the extent that the strategy seems to be that if they just keep stringing you along for long enough, you'll eventually stop asking them and they can just quietly drop it. So keep asking the question, keep the pressure on, keep organisations that are responsible for these things, keep them aware that we are watching.
Yeah.
And I know that sounded creepy, but that's what I was going for. So
is it creepy for us to be just constantly standing outside of a politician's window going, what are you doing about this now? Because that's what I've been doing.
I mean,
I don't want to mention the particular politician I've been doing that to, just so, I don't go to prison.
In the social media setting, obviously, in a sense, no, as in legit, that's kind of what we're doing. Whereas previously, you had to physically go to a politician's house and stand in the garden and say, oi! Whereas now...
Oh, that's what I've been doing.
Oh, okay, cool. Whereas now, we've all got the option to do that on Twitter, which obviously is a nest of vipers and a garbage place, but it's still there, and people do use it, and people care about their numbers, their likes, their reach, and clout. out.
I do have to say, people really seem to assume that the What the Trans Twitter has a lot of clout because of we've just peaked at 12,000 followers, but it doesn't feel that way sometimes. But yeah, I know what you mean. There is that pressure. But just to also need to mention, I haven't actually been committing trespassing and creeping on politicians.
Aww.
I know that there's going to be some people out there who are listening to this looking for reasons to hate trans people. That's a thing that's happening now. There are definitely anti-trans people listening, and now I have to make these clarifications now because they'll just be like, "Oh look, there's Michelle Snow admitting to creeping on politicians."
No, I don't really have anything else to add to that, apart from it's a good idea. It's a good point that you clarified that. I'm astonished that we have 12,000 people following us on Twitter. That's loads. That's easily
That's pretty rad, right?
It's 11,999 more than I ever thought there would be.
Yeah.
So...
But yeah, thank you for listening to that. I hope you got some stuff from it. And yeah, I would encourage you to go to Stonewall's website, check out what they do. They have a press release section, which essentially outlines everything that they do. In some cases, that is more informative than the news section or the blog section on their website. So I would keep an eye on what they do, because I think there's a thing where a lot of people don't necessarily know what Stonewall are up to at certain points because they don't get the media coverage that they deserve.
And there's the old adage, actions speak louder than words, and they are taking action, as Nancy outlined for us. So anyway.
Yeah. But that's the show.
That is indeed the show. That about wraps it up for this week. We shall be back, of course, next week. In the meantime, if you particularly need to get in touch with us or just particularly want to, you can do so on facebook.com/whatthetrans, Twitter @whatthetrans, we're at whatthetrans.medium.com, where we occasionally spew out blog posts, and there's our shiny website, which is whatthetrans.com. But thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
This episode of What the Trans was produced by Michelle Snow and Ashley Talbot and was edited by Michelle Snow, me, very weird to read out my own name, but I'll do it anyway, credits, Mara Reynolds and Ben Swithin. We would like to give some special thanks to our patron producers who are
Kai Passon,
Mallory Moore,
Chrissy Jarvis,
Stuart Gray,
Nick Ross,
Alice Chalkley,
Jasmine,
Sim,
Melody Nix,
Zoe Laura Meyer,
Fiona Punchard,
John,
Lynn Mackay,
Nick Duffy,
CB Bailey,
Gordon Cameron,
Peter Kimball,
Rachel T.S.,
Wen Riverup,
Vic Parsons,
Tila Wild,
Atom James,
Vanessa Billington,
Tower Watch,
Rowan Littlejohns,
Desiree Markland,
Samantha Raven,
Patreon user,
Derek Victor,
Sarah Bedful of Dogs Halliwell,
Emma Doyle,
Mike Dickinson,
Owen Willis,
Catherine,
Mina,
Elliot McVeigh,
Cassius Adair,
Tuck,
Melissa Brooks,
Ian Cumber,
Maddie Bell,
Karakan12,
April Heller,
Sophie Lewis,
Alexandra Lilly,
Claire Scott,
Ariadne Pena,
Lauren O'Nions,
Mara Reynolds,
Bernard Pink Jellybean,
and Lanos. Thank you to you all. Goodbye.